In November 1986, a wealthy businessman in one of New Jersey's most exclusive neighborhoods wrote a note, withdrew $2 million in cash, and disappeared. Doug Levin was 42 years old when he vanished from his Alpine mansion, leaving behind a wife, 2 teenage daughters, and the message so cryptic that investigators would spend the next decade trying to decipher it. But the truth about what happened to Doug Levin wouldn't surface until 15 years later, when a construction crew made a discovery that would inspire one of America's most successful crime novelists. Douglas Martin Levin had built the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. At 42, he owned a sprawling colonial mansion on Closter Dock Road in Alpine, New Jersey, one of the wealthiest zip codes in America. His neighbors included celebrities and Wall Street executives, but Doug had made his fortune differently. He'd started with a single electronics store in Hackensack in 1971 and built it into a chain of 17 locations across North Jersey by 1986. His wife Carol would later describe him as a man of rigid routines. Every morning at 5:45, Doug would wake up, brew exactly 4 cups of coffee in the same Mr. Coffee machine they'd received as a wedding gift, and read the financial section of 3 different newspapers before anyone else in the house stirred. Carol, who still wore the tennis bracelet Doug had given her for their 10th anniversary, despite never playing the sport, had a habit of humming Carole King songs while cooking something that always made Doug smile. He kept a leather-bound journal where he recorded not just business ideas but personal thoughts pages Carol wouldn't read until after he disappeared. Their daughters Michelle, 16, and Jennifer, 14, knew their father as someone who never missed a school event. Despite running a multi-million-dollar business, Doug had attended every soccer game, every piano recital. Michelle would later tell investigators that her father had a peculiar habit. Whenever he was stressed, he would organize things, not clean organize. She'd find him at midnight, arranging the tools in the garage by size or alphabetizing the spice rack. Jennifer remembered how he taught her to ride a bike by running alongside her for hours, never losing patience even after she crashed into the garden gnome 6 times. And so on the morning of November 12, 1986, when Carol found the spice rack meticulously arranged and every tool in the garage laid out in perfect rows, she felt a chill run down her spine. Doug hadn't come to bed the night before, not unusual during inventory season, but something about the precision of the organization felt different. Final. It was then that she found the note. Written on Doug's personal stationery, the message was brief. "The money is for you and the girls. Don't try to find me." The answer was always in the tennis court. "I'm sorry. D." Carol's hands shook as she read it 3 times. The tennis court? They didn't own a tennis court. Doug didn't even play tennis. He had a bad shoulder from a college football injury that made serving impossible. She ran to Doug's study. The safe was open, empty except for family photos, and Michelle's kindergarten art project, a clay handprint Doug had kept for 11 years. The bank would later confirm that Doug had withdrawn $2 million in cash over the course of 6 weeks, structuring the withdrawals to avoid federal reporting requirements. The money, packed in 2 large duffel bags, had been sitting in the trunk of his Mercedes, which was now gone. Bergen County Detective Ray Morrison arrived at the Levin house at 9:17 a.m. With 25 years on the force, Morrison had worked plenty of missing person cases, but wealthy businessmen didn't usually vanish with cryptic notes about tennis courts. "The first thing that struck me was how organized everything was," Morrison would later recall. "This wasn't a man who left in a panic. Every document we might need, insurance policies, bank statements, business records, was laid out on his desk like he'd prepared them for us." But as Morrison began interviewing employees at Levin's electronics stores, disturbing details emerged. For the past 3 months, Doug had been acting strangely. He'd installed new locks on his office door locks that even his business partner of 15 years, Steve Roth, didn't have keys to. He'd started staying late, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning, claiming he was reviewing inventory. Therefore, when Roth finally convinced building maintenance to open Doug's locked office, what they found inside made no sense. The walls were covered with photographs, not of electronics or business plans, but of tennis courts. Dozens of them. Public courts, private clubs, even construction blueprints, red string connected to photos like something out of a detective movie. But the most unsettling discovery was a second journal, hidden inside a hollowed-out accounting textbook. Unlike the personal journal Carol knew about, this one was filled with paranoid ramblings about being watched, about them getting closer, about a mistake he'd made before the girls were born. And so naturally, Morrison's investigation shifted. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. The question was no longer where Doug Levin had gone, but what he was running from, or who. The deeper Morrison dug into Doug Levin's past, the more the successful businessman's image began to crack. Levin Electronics might have been legitimate, but Doug's seed money had come from somewhere, and that somewhere was increasingly looking like it had connections to North Jersey's construction industry, an industry that, in the 1970s, had significant mob influence. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Carol Levin revealed that in 1971, before Doug opened his first store, he'd worked briefly for a construction company called Barone Development. The owner, Vincent Barone, had been indicted in 1979 for racketeering but never convicted. Several key witnesses had disappeared before the trial. But that wasn't even the worst part. Morrison tracked down Doug's employment records. For 6 months in 1971, Doug had been listed as a site supervisor for Barone Development, specifically overseeing the construction of, and this made Morrison's blood run cold, the Alpine Country Club, the same country club that had 6 tennis courts. Therefore, Morrison's team descended on the Alpine Country Club with ground-penetrating radar. They scanned every inch of those tennis courts, but the technology in 1986 wasn't what it is today. They found nothing conclusive. The country club's board, filled with influential Bergen County residents, pressured the police to wrap up what they called a disruptive wild goose chase. What they discovered next would change everything. But Morrison couldn't let it go, especially after what happened next. On December 3rd, 3 weeks after Doug's disappearance, Carol Levin received a phone call at 2 a.m. The voice was muffled, possibly deliberately distorted. All it said was, "Stop looking or you'll join him." The call was traced to a payphone in Newark, but security footage from a nearby store had been mysteriously erased, and so the investigation stalled. Officially, Doug Levin was listed as a voluntary missing person. The $2 million in cash was never recovered. Carol and the girls eventually moved to Connecticut to escape the whispers and stares. Morrison retired in 1995 with the Levin case still haunting him, but the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. What they didn't know was that 15 years later, time itself would solve the mystery. In May 2001, the Alpine Country Club decided to renovate their tennis facilities. The old courts, installed in 1971, were showing their age. On May 15th, construction crews began breaking up the concrete of court number 3. 20 feet down, in what should have been solid earth, a worker's excavator hid something metallic. At first, they thought it might be an old septic tank. But as they cleared away more dirt, they realized they were looking at the roof of a car. A 1986 Mercedes 560 salvage bike, New Jersey plates. Inside the trunk, wrapped in industrial plastic, were 2 duffel bags. But they didn't contain $2 million. They contained something far more disturbing. Doug Levin's remains, along with those of another man whose identity would shock everyone who thought they knew this case. The second body was Vincent Barone, Jr., the son of Doug's former employer. Barone Jr. had supposedly died in a boating accident in 1971. His body never recovered from the Hackensack River, but here he was, 30 years later, sharing a trunk with Doug Levin. The construction site fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the Palisades, the same sound Doug would have heard in his final moments. The medical examiner determined both men had been shot with the same .38 caliber weapon, but 3 decades apart. Barone in 1971, Levin in 1986. The positioning of the bodies suggested Doug had been forced to lie next to Barone's remains before being shot. Based on the position of his watch, stopped at 3:47 a.m., Doug had spent his last hours knowing exactly what was coming. A receipt in his pocket, timestamped 3:15 a.m., from a 24-hour diner, had a single word written on the back in shaky handwriting: Michelle. And so the truth began to emerge. Doug Levin hadn't been running from the mob. He'd been living with a secret for 15 years. In 1971, as a young construction supervisor, desperate for money to start his business, he'd witnessed or possibly participated in Vincent Barone Jr.'s murder. The senior Barone had used Doug to help bury his own son under what would become Tennis Court 3, ensuring Doug's silence through a combination of payoff money and the threat of mutual destruction. But in 1986, with the FBI closing in on various mob operations and witnesses being offered immunity, someone decided Doug Levin posed too much of a risk. The cryptic note wasn't Doug's confession. It was dictated to him. The $2 million wasn't running money. It was a final payoff to keep Carol and the girls from asking questions. The precision of Doug's final organization spree now made heartbreaking sense. He knew they were coming. He'd arranged everything to protect his family from learning the truth, but ultimately couldn't escape the grave he'd helped dig 15 years earlier. Vincent Barone Sr. had died in prison in 1998, taking many secrets with him. Without living conspirators, prosecutors couldn't build a case. The investigation was officially closed in 2002, with both deaths ruled as organized crime-related homicides. Carol Levin refused all interview requests. Michelle and Jennifer, now in their 30s, released a single statement: "Our father was a good man who made one terrible mistake as a young person. We choose to remember the dad who never missed a soccer game." The $2 million was never found. Investigators suspected it went to whoever pulled the trigger in 1986, payment for tying up a loose end that had been buried for 15 years. 5 years after the bodies were discovered, a young writer named Harlan Coben was researching New Jersey crime stories for his new novel. The Levin case, with its themes of buried secrets, suburban darkness, and the past's refusal to stay hidden, would influence elements of multiple bestsellers. Coben has never confirmed which specific novels drew from the case, but readers familiar with the true story can spot the echoes: ordinary people with extraordinary secrets, tennis courts hiding dark truths, and the understanding that in places like Bergen County, the perfect life might be the most dangerous lie of all. Doug Levin was 27 when he helped bury Vincent Barone Jr. He lived another 15 years before that grave claimed him too.